Hello, Best Guy here with another top 5 video. So, we last spoke about the top 5 worst comic book movies of all time, but there's also really good ones. Actually, now I would say you would see more good comic book movies than terrible ones. Like, for every 10 good comic book movies, you'll have a fan forced it. But for the most part, most comic book movies now are pretty good. Even the ones that are mediocre are okay. But it's really hard to come up with a concise 5 comic book movies that stand the test of time, and I think they'll still be remembered for many years to come. At number 5, we have the movie that jump-started the MCU, and that movie is Iron Man. Iron Man 1. It came out in 2008, and it came out at the same time as The Dark Knight, and it did incredibly well. Of course, there's things in the movie now that haven't aged really well, especially in terms of dialogue. Like there's a scene where Robert Downey Jr. Is in this truck, and he's being escorted, and this guy wants to take a picture with him, and he says, make sure not to put this on your MySpace page. Of course, MySpace is no longer around, but there's still a lot of cool gadgets in this movie that I would still love to see in real life, and it still looks ahead of its time. And there's some clever lines. There's like a line where Pepper Potts is throwing out the girl that Tony Stark slept with, and she goes, "You're the famous Pepper Potts. I see he still has you cleaning around." And he goes, "Yes, I clean around, and sometimes, occasionally, I throw out the trash." I love that line. It's really funny. But the movie is great not just because it started the MCU. It's great because it has a good set of cast, and it has a cool storyline. It shows how intelligent Tony Stark's character is. It starts with him being captured, and he has to use his wits in a cave to create the first Iron Man suit and escape from all these villains who have him captured. And then, of course, you finally meet the real villain in this film, played by Jeff Bridges, which is Obadiah Stane, which I still think is one of the better villains in the MCU. Of course, not as good as Thanos or Killmonger, but still a really interesting villain, the guy who just wants more power, but he's just not as smart as Tony Stark's character. Of course, you have certain things here that didn't carry over to the rest of the MCU, like the guy who was supposed to play War Machine. Yeah, Terrence Howard wanted more money, so they said, "Fuck you, get out," and they ended up getting another actor. But yeah, I love Iron Man 1. The effects still hold up, and the storyline is really good. So that's my number 5. So number 4, this is a movie, of course, in terms of visual effects, has not aged very well. But at the time, it was very revolutionary, and it has still, in my opinion, the best Superman of all time, Christopher Reeve. And that movie is Superman, the movie, directed by Richard Donner. This movie came out in 1978, and at the time it revolutionized special effects because it showed a guy actually flying, and it seemed very realistic. Of course, if you watch it today, you can tell it's a man being held by strings, and you can tell a lot of the stuff is miniature, especially towards the end with the earthquake. A lot of the scenes, especially in Krypton, when it blows up, if you look closely, once it blows up, you can see the curtain in the background curled up. They didn't stretch out the curtain really well, so you can tell it was done on a set. But even with all the imperfections it has in terms of the visual effects, and even plot holes in the story, like at the end when Superman already turned back time, and he comes and saves Lois, and sees that Lois is okay, Jimmy Olsen comes running saying, "Superman, you left me all the way back there in an earthquake? What the fuck are you talking about, Jimmy? There was no earthquake. He turned back time." So there's a lot of plot holes. And even Lois Lane's like, "Oh, those earthquake poles falling." It's like, and Superman, as charismatic as he is, I was kind of busy, Lois. You should have said, "Bitch, you and Jimmy Olsen need to take some medication. I turned back time. You shouldn't even know this."
Or reread the script.
Reread the script. But even with that, this movie is one of the best comic book movies because it has Christopher Reeve playing Superman, there's been many actors who've played the part. You know, there's been Dean Cain, there's been Henry Cavill and Brandon Routh, and each one has brought their own thing to the role, but it's literally Christopher Reeve who brought in how can you distinguish Clark Kent from Superman? Because in the comics, he was just a mild-mannered reporter. He was just a regular guy, and he just took out his glasses, got into the phone booth, and became Superman. There was nothing to distinguish, and Christopher Reeve made the character of Clark Kent this bumbling idiot who was not confident in himself, very unsure, and then when he was very slouchy, no one would suspect that he is Superman. But once he took off those glasses and became very macho, he became Superman. So I love this movie, and it has Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor, and it has Marlon Brando playing Jor-El. And here's the thing, Marlon Brando, Once upon a time, I think probably in the 50s when he made Streetcar Named Desire, Julius Caesar, and all the Wild Ones, and even Apocalypse Now, those are his great acting roles. But everyone says that he was great as Jor-El. I thought he was terrible. He was boring. He had no emotion. You can tell he's reading, and it's true. He was reading lines from a clipboard. Like, people had to hold these boards with the lines they had to say, and it just is so bad. I say the same thing about Alec Guinness playing Obi-Wan. You can tell that he was bored playing that role. But, again, the movie itself is really good. Of course, Marlon Brando actually admits that he did this movie for the money. He got paid at the time $3 million, which is unheard of for like 2 weeks of work. But he was Marlon Brando, and he came late to set, he was fat, he didn't care. And even Christopher Reeve in an interview with David Letterman, he said that the guy didn't care. He really didn't care. He just took his money and ran away. So, but it's because of Superman that you had pioneering in special effects and further comic book movies, even though it took another 10 years to see another comic book movie like Batman. Of course, you had the terrible Supergirl movie, but that doesn't count. We're going to forget about that. But it was a special kind of movie. This was during a time where America was different. The world was very different. It was more friendly, of course. It's more lighthearted. At the time, this was considered a little more darker. But, of course, now it's considered very, very tame. But it was done at a very different time. And if you want to see like, the birth of like comic book movies, and it has some great composed theme by John Williams, and great cinematography, especially in the scenes shot in Smallville. I really recommend Superman the movie. So number 3, we have the big hit of this year, Marvel's Avengers Infinity War Disney Productions. Infinity War. I really love this movie. I saw it in the theater only once. I typically watch movies more than once in the theater, and I actually want to see the second time. I eventually will once I get the Blu-ray. But this film did a great job with the visual effects, with the acting, in culminating 10 years of work that MCU has been working with. And it all ties up pretty well. And of course, we're going to get another continuation, I believe is next year. And my God, the job that Josh Brolin did playing Thanos was spectacular. It's one of the best villains I've ever seen. He's literally, to me, the best villain in the MCU. Second would be Killmonger. Third, maybe Obadiah Stane. But he did so good because everything he says, he does. And that doesn't mean that, like, because typically villains always lay out their plans, and you know by the end that the heroes are always going to prevail and win. But here, the villain, his motivation is clear. He has an arc, and you actually, even though I do not agree with what he's saying, I kind of get where he's coming from. Like, he literally wants to, like, save humanity in a sense by getting rid of half of the world. It's too extreme, but, like, I get where you're coming. That's how you kind of should do a villain. You don't agree with the character, with the villain, but you understand his motives. And that's how you make a fleshed out villain in this film. And everyone was given equal amount of screen time. Even the little henchman characters from Thanos are really good. They're actually difficult to defeat. It almost feels like when you're playing a video game, the few times I've actually played video games in the 90s, you start off in the first level, it's kind of easy, in the middle is still easy, but then when you get to the end, even the third bad boss is difficult to beat. That's how it feels with these like villains that the Avengers have to try to defeat. And then you have a lot of comedic lines in this movie. You have Hulk, who has been out for some of the other movies. He finds out there was an Ant-Man, we have a Spider-Man. Like, he finds out all these other characters who are now in the Avengers team, and then he says, "Oh, you know, we're no longer the Avengers." What? You split up like a band? And I thought it was pretty funny. And it's also really funny how he's trying to bring out the Hulk, and he doesn't want to come out. He's like, "Ah, you big bully!" So, and of course, it's funny because you don't see Black Panther as much. And I think had this been shot before Black Panther, or even before Black Panther was in production, well, actually during Black Panther's production, I think this movie would have had more of the Black Panther character because no one expected Black Panther to be such a humongous hit. So, but still, I think they gave him a good amount of screen time. I just think they probably would have given him more. And of course, I'm not going to give any spoilers or anything, but this ending was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. You know, I even saw, like, typically when you watch a movie, I saw this around the week that it opened, because there was still a lot of people in the movie theater. I hate when people are talking during movies, and it's really annoying. But I've never seen such a great audience where in scenes where people had to be quiet, there was complete silence. And it was terrible, because there was a point where I wanted to fart, and I just had to hold it in, because you don't want to hear a fart when people are talking about something really important. So number 2, we have Spider-Man 2. A lot of people love Tom Holland playing Peter Parker Spider-Man. I get it, he's a 19-year-old, or he's not 20, but he's still playing a teenager. He looks like a teenager. He's great in the MCU. He's doing a great job. But once upon a time in 2004, we had Spider-Man 2, and I still love the first Spider-Man just as much, or around the same level as Spider-Man 2. The first two Spider-Man movies are great. And it was a time when there was no universe. It was just a movie. It was just a comic book movie that came out, and it was great. What I see in difference between Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, at least in Spider-Man 2, versus what I see in Homecoming, is that in Homecoming, while it plays kind of like a coming-of-age kind of movie and a bit of a comedy, Spidey in the comics is us. He's the guy who gets beaten up, he gets trashed all the time, and somehow still finds the courage to prevail. And that's what we see in Spider-Man 2. Throughout the whole movie, he's trying to be the good guy, but he can't catch a break. He's late on his rent. Mary Jane wants nothing to do with him. His friend is completely depressed because of his father died, and he wants to kill Spider-Man, and he doesn't know that he's Spider-Man. So much stuff is going on, and you have a great villain played by Alfred Molina of Dr. Octopus, Dr. Octavius Octopus. And every scene in this movie, especially that scene in the train, still holds up today. The score by Danny Elfman, everything in this movie works so well. And I know a lot of people, shit on Spider-Man 3, and I still think Spider-Man 3 is an okay movie. Sure, it has certain moments that for some people it overshadows the rest of the film, like when he's doing this. I don't even have a problem with this scene. I really don't. I do have a problem in the scene where he goes on a date with Gwen Stacy, and he says, "Get a load of this," and he starts doing this really weird thing with the chair. Had they removed that, and the part where she says, "You did that all for her," if they removed that, I think the rest of the movie would have been okay. Sure, you have the whole thing with Venom showing up, in the middle of the movie, which felt was really dumb, and Topher Grace wasn't really good playing the character Venom. Even though he actually worked out for the role, he got bulky, it didn't really work for that movie. Something about him just doesn't work playing that character. But with Spider-Man 2, you have a good balance of villains, being only one villain, just Doc Ock. And you have all the troubles that Peter Parker's going through. And I believe it's in Spider-Man 2, there's a great scene that no one really talks about. Everyone kind of says, why does this scene happen? It's a scene where Peter Parker's looking out the window, he's just thinking about life, and the girl who's next door, who's a daughter of the guy, says, give me rent, give me rent. She comes in and say, hey Peter, would you like some cookies? I'm baking some cookies. And he goes, sure. And that scene draws out for a while, and I've heard people say that they find it kind of awkward. That's him just eating cookies and drinking milk. Because when you watch that movie, throughout the beginning all the way up until that point, nothing but shit has been happening to him. He's flunking school, no one likes him as Spider-Man, he's getting drunk, his Mary Jane wants nothing to do with him, and the only act of kindness that's been done for him, or any acknowledgement that he exists, is giving him a cookie. So that scene alone, that's explanation as to how I see that sequence. But everything from there on, pay attention to what happens. Every consequence has, every action that he has is consequence. He gets fired from his job. He goes even to buy flowers, and he can't afford to buy all the flowers. All these things, if they implement them to some of the other Spider-Man movies that they're doing now, I think that would work to their favor. Because that's how Peter Parker Spider-Man is written in the comics. So even though I'm not a big comic book reader, when I was a kid, the ones I do remember reading were Spider-Man. So and Spider-Man 2 does a great job. Sure, there are certain things that are not exactly how they were in the comics, but it's still a great cinematic film. And it was done in a time when there were no universes or anything like that. So, but what can be number one? So, number one for me, this is tough because I like two of the films in this series, and depending on the time, it changes. Sometimes it's Batman Begins, and sometimes it's The Dark Knight. I like both of them, but I'm going to put The Dark Knight as number one. And sure, many people call this a crime film rather than a comic book movie, but it is based on a comic book character. The Dark Knight, what I like about this film is that for once, the Joker, Batman, Commissioner Gordon, every character feels realistic. Not necessarily in a real world, because the problem, people think this movie takes place in the real world. It doesn't, it's just more realistic. A lot of things that happen in this movie that wouldn't happen in real life. Like a scene where Batman goes to Hong Kong to get a guy out of a building using an old ass plane to get him all the way back to Gotham so the guy can be extradited and take it back into the judicial system of Gotham. That wouldn't happen, of course not. But then again, Batman would not exist in real life. There's still no billionaire out there who wants to dress in the Batsuit and ride around and defeat crime. It would be cool though, but it doesn't happen. The movie, I think, even though it's been 10 years, there's been so many other comic book adaptations of the character. There's been Ben Affleck playing the role, you've had Jared Leto playing Joker, and none of them work. I mean, Ben Affleck, I think he was okay in BVS, even the fight sequence in the warehouse was pretty cool, but the movie itself wasn't really good. And sure, you have some complaints about Christian Bale doing that really gravelly voice, like, where's the trigger? I don't know how he did that with all three films, and they got progressively more deeper. Heath Ledger did an amazing job playing the Joker, and that's something that everyone says, but it really is true. He actually steals the show, and it's one of those movies that I think will always be remembered. Like, everyone quotes the lines in this movie, like, I wanna know how I got these scars, or, you have, most of them are Joker lines, like, when you have Michael J. White saying, you brought him in dead, that's, I think it's $5,000 or something like that, and he goes, how about alive? I wanna make this pencil disappear. Like, all these lines are very, very memorable. And not just that, is the fact that Batman acts like a detective. There's that sequence where he grabs the piece of brick and he is investigating how that shrapnel of the bullet was, what bullet was used to shoot into that brick. There's a lot of cool things in this movie that people forget. It's not just the fact that it's a Batman movie, but it's also a crime investigation film that correlates in the comic book world. And it's sad that Heath Ledger didn't go on to do anything else because he passed away. He didn't get to finish a movie called Imaginary with Dr. Parnassus, but that one was alright. But The Dark Knight is literally the highlight of his career, and sadly we will never get to see anything that he will make. But this is number one, and these are all the 5 films that I think are the best comic book movies. Obviously there's a whole bunch that are really good. There's gazillions of them. But if I didn't get to mention, please let me know in the comments section down below. I more than gladly would like to see what are some of the comic book movies that you like that I didn't get to mention. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, share this video with all your comic book fans, friends who are fans of comic books, of course. And check out all the stuff that's here on Dropping Loads. There's a bunch of cool videos every week, every day of the week. It's not just me, there's a lot of people here. So anyway, guys, until next time.